All right, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Dr. Benedict, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Fantastic. I appreciate all of you for coming out on this Monday evening. I know this is like one of the worst days of the events. You usually don't come out, but you came out tonight for this wonderful event about our upcoming report that we published recently. You sit down up here, this chair is a Creole. Feel free to walk in. So, is this anyone's first time coming to an LDS show of hands? Okay, there are a lot of newcomers today. Okay, so my name is Adam Jackson. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. And so we are a grassroots think tank located here in Baltimore City. We do political advocacy for the Black community, particularly in the area of public policy. And so this is a very busy time of year, as some of you may know, because right now there's the Maryland General Assembly that happens between January and April. And so a lot of the issues you're going to be hearing about tonight from Lawrence, we're actually currently advocating for in the Maryland General Assembly. And so one of the things I did want to mention before we get started is just a couple of things about LDS, because a lot of you are new to learning about our organization, is that first off, we've been around since 2010. I've been around for about 13 years. And so one of the main things that we focused on for the past several years is criminal justice reform around, and also, generally speaking, making sure that the Black community has control of its own destiny when it comes to public and private resources. And one of the things that we often find is that in the human social service sector and the nonprofit sector, there is an intentional effort to undermine Black political control over our institutions that govern our lives. And so we catch a lot of flack from a lot of mainstream institutions because, at the end of the day, it's about what's good for Black folks and ensuring that Black people have control over the institutions that govern the lives of Black people. And while that sounds pretty uncontroversial when we say it out loud, people may be unsurprised to find out that when we encounter some of these larger institutions and civic formations, people try to undermine us. And so I want to talk a little bit about how LDS is constituted, because a lot of people think we're a nonprofit, they think we get grant money to do advocacy work, and then we just do kind of the run-of-the-mill political advocacy stuff. Number one, we are not a nonprofit. We're organized as a for-profit enterprise because we find that if you get grant money to do political advocacy, there are very firm limitations of what you can do and what you can say. And so we recognized that early on, and so we organized our organization as a business because it meant that no one could determine what we could do with our own money. And a lot of people ask us, well, if you're not a nonprofit, how do you get funded? And so we do a lot of, contractual work with various institutions, but the primary way that our organization makes money is that people contribute to our organization on a monthly basis. And people don't think that's possible a lot of times. Like, you need to tell me someone gave $5 a month, my grandma gave $5 a month, and that's just what funds your organization? And the answer is yes, that pays bills. That makes sure that we can pay for stuff like Ubers to go to Annapolis and come back to Baltimore to do programs like this. The actual programs that we got printed tonight are printed from sustainer money, money that people give every month. And so when we encourage people to give to LBS, it's not to give to us as individuals, it's to the actual work that we're doing to sustain the institution. And so before you leave tonight, hopefully there's a flyer out front that has a message that says become a sustainer. You scan that QR code, you become a sustainer. You can give as little as $5 a month. You can give $10 a month. You can give $100 a month if you can afford that. But we prefer that you donate to our organization because it's the way that we keep the lights on and keep this work continuous. And one last thing I'll say before Lawrence comes up, one thing that I think that people overlook when we talk about, grassroots political advocacy is that we can actually win when we do grassroots political advocacy. Because some people think that if you're grassroots, you can't win. It's assumed that you're going to lose and that you're fighting a good fight with no resources and that Black people can never win. And I just want to be very clear, we have won several times in a row, not just our organization, but other grassroots political formations here in Baltimore. I'll give 3 clear examples of that, and then I'll let Lawrence come up and get us into today's conversation. So one thing that happened in 2016 is that Baltimore City voters created the Baltimore Children Youth Fund. That fund is a $12 billion non-lasting fund that funds programs that support children and youth in Baltimore. And when we heard about it, we heard that white nonprofit formations were trying to crowd around it to do what they do, to take resources from the government and to hoard them and to control them in the name of funding Black organizations. And currently, after about 6 years of advocacy on the subject, the Baltimore Children Youth Fund is now a Black-controlled organization with a 100% Black board, with a 100% Black, about an 80% Black staff, The first executive director is a black woman, and it controls all those resources, and the majority of the money that gets out every year is to black organizations. That's because of black political advocacy like us and other folks. That's one example. I'll give you a second example. Currently, there is the Pennsylvania Avenue Black Arts and Entertainment District that exists in West Baltimore on Pennsylvania Avenue. Who's not here tonight, her name is Lady Brion, world-renowned poet who just did the Woman of the World Poetry Slam this past weekend. Currently, the Black Arts District is the only Black Arts and Entertainment District in the state, and probably one of the only few in the country. And right now, they're trying to build a community center on Pennsylvania Avenue to ensure that we can revitalize that area without gentrifying black people out of it. And currently, and again, people can't imagine what that looks like. We talk about it so much theoretically, but that's the culmination of about 6-7 years worth of work. And again, black people can win. The last thing I'll talk about is actually germane to our conversation tonight about reparations. So last year, of course, the Maryland General Assembly passed a referendum that said, that the marijuana should be legal in Maryland. Of course, voters approved it. But a part of that legislation last year was a community reinvestment fund, which essentially is going to give reparations for the war on drugs in the state of Maryland, and that money will be funded by tax revenues here in the state of Maryland. And that happened. We got reparations for the war on drugs. And when we tell people that, that's like, well, what do you mean we got reparations for the war? I mean, we got money to go to black people to fix communities that were ravaged by the war on drugs. And in Baltimore, and every jurisdiction has to figure out how it's going to distribute that money, and it's going to be distributing that money proportionate to the impact of the war on drugs on it. So of course, Baltimore is going to get the majority of those resources. But now we have to figure out how that's going to happen, and currently that legislation is being considered in Baltimore City Council. And so when that legislation passes, again, that'll be an example of winning when you do grassroots political advocacy. So all the things I just said are wins and reasons that you should donate to LBS, because this allows us to continue this grassroots political advocacy here in Baltimore. Because I know folks may not be familiar with us, but just to give you a picture, a small piece of the things that we do, those are the things that we do. So I'll stop talking, and I'll bring up Grandpre. He's a co-founder and director of research for Leaders of the Beautiful Struggle, and he will be presenting on the report that that was commissioned by him, the communal impacts of drug criminalization in Maryland. So go ahead, Marcus.
Sit down, make sure I'm in. Am I going to be the front of the live stream right here?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm gonna need a lot of clicking. So just so make sure the person who knows that just knows that it's not too much PowerPoint. I'm gonna, every slide has multiple clicks in it, so just be attentive to the click points. Good evening, everybody. My name is Grandpre. I'm the director of research for LBS. So this talk is a few years in the making. I guess you could say its genesis is a meeting we had with OSF, Open Society Foundation, in 2019, where they wanted us to work on Maryland legislation decriminalizing opioids. So obviously with the overdose epidemic, the criminalization of opioids is deterrent to people calling for help in the moments of overdose and people cycling getting out of prison. Hurts their tolerance, it causes trauma. The one thing we told them is like, look, like this is an important issue, but we're already doing reparations for the war on drugs. And as important as that issue is, we want to make sure that we actually have resources for our community, because sometimes drug policy has like a libertarian framework, where it's literally just about individual freedom. And what I've been trying to tell folks is that that libertarian framework has worked in some places like Oregon to get drug policy passed, but actually hurts you when you go back to ask for reinvestment. So, but I realize I'm just one person saying this, but I know there are whole communities of people that have felt similar things about the story we're told about we take anything we can get, every reform is good, every nonprofit does a little bit of good, saves lives, but there is a deeper story around drug criminalization. It doesn't just lock people up. It hurts entire communities, which means that I couldn't feel comfortable supporting decrim unless what's running around restoring those communities, which I think would not only be a better policy, but part of the idea that I'm getting with this report is that actually a policy is more likely to pass in a state like Maryland. So you can go ahead and start clicking this here now. Again. So this has been the faith of addiction. Go back. So yeah, so I'm gonna squeeze my hand like this and try to go, right? So go back. right? So this has been the face of addiction for a long time. So people probably watch The Wire, this is bubbles from The Wire. So if you look at how he actually got clean in The Wire, he actually had to go to a 12-step meeting. And his sponsor in the back is a white guy, right? So this has been the face of addiction for a long time. It's been Black criminalization and needing spirituality as a solution. So not systemic, not even biomedical, which I'm obviously not the biggest fan of. We'll get to that talk later. But if we go, we're seeing a change in the face of addiction. So this is the quote-unquote new face of addiction. With the opioid crisis, we've had an opioid crisis in the Black community for a long time, very least since the 70s. You know, James Lamb was talking about heroin, the white horse in the 70s. It's not even the first fentanyl epidemic. China White, that's fentanyl.
Yeah.
Right? So this is not a new rodeo for us, but with the rise of white women getting opioid addiction, we have this new approach to medicalize the addiction epidemic. So this is Suboxone. This is a synthetic opioid that you can actually take like methadone, but unlike methadone, you don't have to show up every day. They don't look into your mouth. You don't have to go to a place that feels like jail to take it. And this is very intentional. We're going to talk a little bit about this later. This was marketed specifically to white people with good insurance because they know that they didn't want to go to methadone clinics. And that's how the drug was profitable. So this is a very intentional, seen as deracialization because they were like, we need to give Black people Suboxone. That's social justice, that's racial equity. Give Black people what white people have. But what I was trying to say to them, and this is part of the idea of the report, is that if you have a Black person who gets out of jail, they're being told so many things. They're being told their community is pathological. They're being told to separate from their friends because their friends are not clean. So you can have a Black person taking Suboxone in their room alone, pathologizing their community. The public health community would view that as a success story because they're not OD. The Black community would view that as a failure because you failed to reintegrate that person into a productive member of society that can serve the community. So this is all in the context of some other dynamics where, one more time. This is oftentimes the face of drug policy. It is, again, comes out of, we can maybe talk a little bit about some Q&A. A lot of folks come out of this work from the 80s work in the 90s. There's a lot of folks who were doing sex work outreach. A lot of folks who were doing needle exchange. So it's a particular community that a lot of public health people, it's tended to skew white in terms of people transition over to like full-time drug policy advocacy. But the problem is in Baltimore, this is increasingly the face of who's going to pass this policy. So people in church groups, people in community groups, people in homeowners associations. So there's a disjunct between the face of drug policy that I just showed you and the face of who's going to pass this policy in the state where the Black caucus is over at least 30% of the lawmakers. In the state's over 30% Black. So I intentionally framed this process as a response to what I saw as the limitations of drug policy framed through public health, framed through the white dominant biomedical model. All right. So let's just go over the TikTok here, the timeline. April 2020, OSF funded University of Maryland School of Social Work to research on the harms of drug criminalization. LBS was brought on as a consultant. Through conversations with University of Maryland LBS, we decided to have LBS use experience of doing political advocacy, teaching, and research to help guide the project. And so this is a co-authored report. My co-author Natalie is here today. Can you stand up for us, Natalie? So Natalie really graciously, basically saw the vision that I was basically bringing to the project. And so we want to reframe decrim through the lens of reparations for the war on drugs, right? So yeah, go keep on. So here's what we did. The goal was to do a literature review, and this is led by Natalie, on how existing literature on how drug criminalization harms individuals' relationships to community through the lens of social capital. So this is a very particular attempt to see what's there now. And we use social capital because we figured that would be a term the literature would be likely to use, even though I'm not in love with social capital as a frame. But this was the important addition, is to conduct interviews with grassroots leaders on the impact of drug criminalization on Black civil society, and to study Black civil society's response to addiction and the war on drugs. So this is part of the conversations we've had at LDS for years with Black elders, and the frame of addiction is beyond just medicalization, just methadone, just needle exchange. People in churches, people who work with youth, people who have family members who are addicted, they are part of the people who are the experts on the impact of the war on drugs on community. but they oftentimes framed out of the catchment area, the lens of research, because they don't have addiction specialists in their name, or they don't have a PhD, or they don't do political science, not elected officials, and they don't have a church. So this was basically seen as having a cross-section of people we know had unique experiences that were reflective of seeing how the war on drugs impacted communities. So the last step is to create recommendations for how drug decrim advocates can craft policy that restores the capacity of Black civil society to meet community needs comprehensively. So this is very different than what typically happens with public health approaches to decriminalization. I'm going to talk about how they approach it later. But the idea is to really make an argument for this to be the frame of decrim in Maryland. Because again, OSF was looking for a report to help decrim pass in Maryland. My idea was to give it to them, but make it very different than what they thought they were funding, right? So this was one of the things that helped frame a lot of the work that we did. This is Naeem Akbar, professor of psychology at Florida State. The Akbar papers in African psychology. So he has what's called the African-centered research paradigm. And I wanted to go over some of the steps today. So theoretical research, and this is going to be the frame of the talk. So I want to basically use this as the different frames for how I present the findings and how I explain the thought process by which we did our work. So start with theoretical research, create theoretical paradigms to understand a problem and generate questions from that theory. So this is blue sky thinking. This is not about advancing an academic paradigm for the sake of advancing an academic paradigm. This is about actually theorizing in a fundamental way how to understand the problem. So deconstructive research, demonstrating the fallacy of the inferences and the methodological distortions of traditional research. So this is part of where the literature review comes in, because the idea is to see what people are saying about how drug criminalization harms communities, but to see what they're not saying, to interrogate some of the silences and limitations in the discourse, to be able to figure out where we could make our additions, right? Research index, extent to which the research identifies with the culture of the subject of research, checking worldviews, concepts of nature for bias. So this is really important. So this is especially with white researchers who are coming to research Black subjects, but even for myself, I have a unique personal experience that's going to color the way that I would view the people that I've been researching. So the idea is to take that actively into account, don't believe in the mythology of objectivity, recognize their social location, and to actually use that as an asset to help you design a better research methodology. Ethnographic research, so observe Black people to identify strengths and self-affirming patterns. This is the qualitative research. And finally, not that this is probably the most important one, heuristic research. Identify culturally adaptive styles and fortify structures that have been demonstrated to be beneficial to the survival and advancement of Black people. Now, this is important because this is the step that's often left off with a lot of traditional academic analyses. A lot of them feel reticent about engaging politics. The goal of the African research politics, the research paradigm, is to get to the political solutions and to use the research to help advocate for those, right? So I wanted to also mention this text. This is Yurugu, Marimba Ali. This also provided some important conceptual framing for some of the things that we wanted to do for this paper. Rhetorical ethics, so this is a very important concept. This is the most ethical statement to purest abstraction. This is one of her critiques of Eurocentric morality. Presenting some of these theories, I think it's going to be important to help understand how to interpret some of the quotes from the people in the report, right? So language around individual freedom used to ignore structural oppression. This is what I was talking about with the libertarian nature of drug policy, that people should be free to consume, and that's their individual choice, and that's important, but that's not the whole story. And she juxtaposes that with existential ethics, which is unity between word and deed. This is going to be really important because this is going to allow us to understand some of the ways in which people in the community are viewing the harms of criminalization, but also the harms of what people are claiming to be the repairing, the response to criminalization. So understanding an existential ethic that I need sees as part of the culture of African people is going to be necessary to understand how to interpret the data, the qualitative data. So dichotomous versus diunital thinking. Dichotomous, di being two. Cotomous sounds like cut. Diunital is the opposite, unity. So in Eurocentric thought systems, a lot of people talk about it being either or, black and white, and having this sort of very clear division in terms of how you think about the world, when African cultures and many cultures of primary peoples have a more complex diunital sort of both and, as opposed to either or way of viewing the world. And so when you talk about how people are interpreting reality and what solutions will be seen as desirable, this sort of thinking is important. So linear, progressive versus cyclical notions of time, again, this is all gonna hopefully make sense when I get to the qualitative data, right? So this idea is that in Eurocentric cultures, there's an idea of inevitable progress. So anything I do is gonna work out. You know, it's kind of the way people twist the Martin Luther King quote, the moral arc of history is long bends towards justice, right? He also said in Letter from Birmingham Jail, you know, no oppression is ever ended, you know, strictly through waiting and time. But people take that quote from him to say that there's this inevitable progress. So any tiny thing we do is all going to accumulate into something better cumulatively in the future, versus cyclical notions of time in African culture, which is, you know, as opposed to time being linear, time being circular, working in cycles. That's going to be really important to see why some of the interventions being proposed by drug policy advocates may be resisted, because people are literally interpreting some different ways of seeing time. So this was just what I did. This would have been like in 2020 during the pandemic. This whole process was not easy. This was all happening during the pandemic, shutdowns, Zoom meetings. But because we couldn't get out to meet in person or talk to people, I did this document. It's on our website. This is not the report. This is the preliminary research I did to help guide the report. But I recommend folks who are interested to check this out too, because this is basically a more in-depth critique, a more in-depth literature review from my perspective, from an African Center research perspective on the literature around drug decriminalization. So it goes more in detail about some of the critiques about how decrim has been presented. And we sort of footnote some of this stuff in our report, but this is what we did in 2020, is talk about this report and produce it, right? So, yeah, I know it's gonna be a lot coming at you. This talk was longer when I presented it in Arizona at the conference, but I want to try to get through as much as possible before I leave time for Q&A, right? But this stuff is important because it explains the political methodology. So I wanted to put this on the table in terms of what are reparations. Reparations was a core Black nationalist demand. How we explain the mainstreaming of the concept. You know, if you look at the 2020 Democratic Party candidates, almost all of them, except Biden, had a reparations platform. This would have been unthinkable 30, 40 years ago, was Queen Moore and the other advocates in Gary using reparations as a way to basically force the Democratic Party to even think about investing in Black people. So how do we explain what's happening here? Reparations has shifted from being centered on repairing the civic and institutional fabric, which existed before the harms of slavery, Jim Crow, and the war on drugs, to being centered on repairing the rift between the oppressed and the oppressor. And if you understand that that's what's happening when people say reparations means basically funding integration. Reparations means funding the existing institutions, which were not designed for us, which were not designed with our unique culture and issues in mind, funding our participation in those institutions. Not that that's inherently wrong, because people need services, but it's largely been framed around integration into housing, integration into mental health services. It's not been framed around investing in Black people's independent capacity to deal with the issues produced by their oppressors themselves. Right? I think that that's important because our conception of reparations to this report is different than the mainstream one. It's that reparations for the war on drugs are centered on restoring civic, communal, and institutional capacity to meet needs in communities most impacted, not just giving them access to what White people have. This isn't a critique of access to things like tobacco. Absolutely not. This is saying that seeing the vista of possibility of social justice as only given tobacco is a powerful tool to round down Black people's suffering and oppression into what is possible for existing institutions. Right? So this is an important distinction between, because some people do make the argument that we just need total separation. And I want to just make it very clear, this is not recognizing there is a role for public health institutions. If part of it is, why can't we operate them? Why can't we run them? Why can't we use the culture and history of Black people to create different forms of practice that will make them more effective? And that's the idea behind the report, to get more qualitative evidence as to why that is necessary. not just for it to work, but also for it to pass. Because I'm arguing that the community won't accept it unless it's that. Okay, so theoretical research on Black civil society. This is a really good book, like Baltimore, A New Theory of Community by Harold McDougall. And he has a quote that I think is a good example of how to understand what Black civil society is. This is a $5 word, this is not a common term, but it's very common for us because I think it expresses something very important. And this quote is the best summation of why it's important. So this is about the Nehemiah Project in Sandtown in the 80s and 90s. It's huge investment of federal money. So I'll just read the quote and then I'll explain why it's important. This is McDougall talking about work done by a community resident named Messina Young to do an analysis of the existing institutions in the footprint before the investment. Right. So this is a down bad community, crack era, the 80s, but this is what was there, and this is why this stuff is important. So I'll just try to read this quickly. Community resident Messina Young carried on a street-level survey of Sandtown with my assistance in the summer of '91. The diversity that we observed in our first assessment was amazing. We had evidence of Muslim and Black nationalist activity, a Muslim carry-out on Carey Street, the Black Nation Builders bookstore on North Avenue, and the home of Rastafarian, the Harry Selassie emblem, and handwritten apocalyptic messages posted on his window. On Black Business Row on North Avenue across the Nation Builders bookstore, Black street vendors who live in the area come out around lunchtime and sing until dusk. Arabers, Black vendors who sell fruits, vegetables, and fish from horse-drawn wagons in West Baltimore gather on Winchester Street at the stable of Sandtown Senior Araber, whose street name is Fatback. There they collect their produce and merchandise to sell on the streets of Sandtown. Fatback stable was later bulldozed to make way for the Nehemiah Project. So what are we seeing there? We're seeing Nehemiah, which is supposed to be basically racial equity before they use that term. Massive investment in housing, everything. Community schools, well, schools in the community, not necessarily community schools. But in order for this to work, all the things that we're seeing in this assessment weren't as relevant to the people doing the investment because it didn't fit what they thought a productive community looked like. So they didn't value this, right? So what they did was this map, and I know this map is hard to see, but if you look at where all the lines are pointing, this is all the housing investment. Right in the center, that's Gilmore Homes, where Freddie Gray lived and unfortunately died. And all of the little lines leading to dots, those are drug nuisance abatement zones. So they weren't just going to invest all this money, they wanted to have policing to protect their investment. So part of the argument that I'm making is that this is the communal impact of drug criminalization, Fatback stable being bulldozed. That type of stuff does not appear in the reports done by mainstream drug policy organizations. But you want to understand that this form of investment is also part of the negative communal impact of drug criminalization. Because in order for them to invest anything in Upton, Sandtown, Winchester, they brought in the police, and that created a cycle of hyper-incarceration, which hollowed out the communal fabric of the community, right? It's not just one person going to jail. That person was also likely paying rent, buying Pampers, paying a car note, helping get somebody to school. So you create what one professor whose work was very important to our project called coercive mobility, which just means you destabilize people's lives so they can't do the work of building basic communal institutions like churches, church groups, after-school centers that can actually restore the community, stabilize it, and give it alternatives to the street economy. So perversely, the more you incarcerate a particular community, the more you drive crime in that community because you're destabilizing it. We deploy more police, do more incarceration, the cycle gets worse. And this is not how the harm of drug criminalization is often told in traditional drug policy spaces. They talk about individual people locked up, usually perfect victims locked up for dime bags a week, but we say no. This is a more central frame to understand how Baltimore experiences the harm of criminalization. So yeah. So it's gonna be difficult. I might have to do this.
Just go past it.
No. This is important. Just you guys go there. You actually gotta go all the way there. So Professor John Paff basically criticizes what he calls the standard model of the war on drugs. He basically ties that to Michelle Alexander. And basically, Michelle Alexander told people a story that was easy to understand, that was politically useful, but what he said was that it was increasingly limited and or counterproductive in some critical ways. So he talks about how Alexander's narrative allowed people to believe that it was small amounts of drugs, people who are carrying possession-wise small amounts of drugs, getting these large mandatory minimum sentences, which drove incarceration. And increasingly, that story is not true anymore. If you have a small amount of drugs on you, you're not put in jail for massively long sentences, especially at the state level. Most people are at the state level of prison when it comes to drugs. But because this story was true at a federal level, and because it told a story about a perfect victim, a perfect, largely innocent, addicted victim who just needed their drugs to feel better, it was politically taken up in ways that made the larger movement against mass incarceration difficult. Because if you look at what's actually filling our jails today, like incarceration is leveled out, it's not dropped. Because we're giving people massively long sentence for basically relatively minor violent crimes. Second-degree assault, possession of a knife, possession of a gun. But because everybody wanted to focus on the easier victims, the people carrying drugs, the actual people filling our jails, people who commit violent crimes or possession and intent to distribute, they just aren't talked about as much. So this is what he calls like a standard model of mass incarceration. So what I realized is that we were developing a standard model of drug decriminalization. Now, similarly, this story was used because it's politically useful. It gave people a story they can understand and sympathize with. And this is the story that dominates drug policy discourse. So I'm going to try to give the most sympathetic version of the argument for the standard model before I present our critique. Because once you understand our critique, then you're going to understand everything else is going to make sense, right? So the standard model of drug decriminalization. This is a story that has worked in Oregon. This is a story that has worked in other states for some policy reforms. This is a story they wanted us to tell in the report. So I'm basically explaining why I didn't tell it, right? So the medical nature of addiction makes criminal justice solutions possible. Addiction is a brain disease, which means individuals pursue drugs no matter the cost. So this is a story I was told of heroin, one time and you're hooked, your brain needs it, you'll sell your mother's, wedding ring just to get a hit, right? Respect individual choices as people rationally pursue pleasure. This is the flip side, right? It's very sensitive. So the flip side is that we should respect people's desire to pursue pleasure through drug use. We're not puritanical. This also is about people having individual rights. Overdose of crime, proof criminalization is failing. Prison cycling equals overdose. So prison cycling is just people going in and out of jail because they're being popped for possession charges. This is, again, the standard argument everybody says when they advocate for opioid decriminalization. Addiction drives crime. It cannot be deterred by police. And the money spent on policing is wasted and can be reallocated. So this is an important part of the story, is that, again, the only feedback we got from OFF really was, what's the number? And the number they were asking for was that number right there, which is we need something to give to journalists that they can understand. And what every other state has done is giving them a number which says the police waste X amount of money policing low-level possession arrests, right? And they said, if we can just give them that number, they can write a story on it. And that means that that story is going to help advocate to push the policy. Because if we can make it about saving money and wasting resources, that's a bipartisan framework that everyone can get behind. Again, standard model, not what we did, but that's the theory. Decrime is the first step towards broader social justice and redistribution. So again, this is a political theory of change. That's the important thing. This isn't about just academic research. It's a political theory of change that's driving research. So my goal is to present, see, tonight time, the alternative theory of change that drove our research. So what they were saying, what the larger drug policy community says, to start with bipartisan, cost-cutting, political low-hanging fruit, and keep people out of jail first and build from there. This isn't a bad argument. This is an inhumane argument. It's very compassionate, at least in some ways, right? Public health solutions can help fill the gap, survive from the right? So this is it. This is the most sympathetic portrayal of the standard model of decrim that I can do in like 3 minutes, right? So I'm just going to. Yeah, I know, but I'm gonna do this and you can go back to it, right? This is just as So I'm just gonna do a brief overview of some of the fundamental questions. But this is, again, this is the deconstructive process. That's why I'm showing it this way. So to understand the Afro-Centered research paradigm, seeing a deconstructive model in practice, I think will be useful. So the medical nature of addiction makes criminal justice solution impossible. Well, if medical nature of addiction, the brain disease model is true, how do you explain people who kick on their own? How do you explain people how do you explain the rat park experiment? So rat park, some of you may have heard of it. It's one of the most famous experiments in all of addiction. When you are given a rat in a cage with no stimulation, no company, a bottle of regular water and a bottle of water with some opioid in it, they drink yolk milk water until they die. So this is what they're using to justify that it's a immutable brain disease. This type of experiments. Bruce Alexander was a Canadian who was like, hey, maybe the way you design the experiment frames the outcomes you're getting. You have to account for the environment. So he creates Rat Park, right? So Rat Park is the left side. You can see, it's a little pixelated, but you can see community, you can see stimulation, you can see, sex partners. And on the right, you see addiction-prone, singular rat in a room by itself. So when you actually put them in Rat Park, the rate of addiction to the opioid-laced water decreased dramatically. And this should not be possible if simply tasting the water made them addicted because of the brain disease. Right? So all besides the difficulty of extrapolating from rats to humans, this is an extremely important finding that challenges the standard model of decrim and the brain disease model of addiction. Another brief example. And again, this is my process before we undergo the research, right? If individuals will pursue drugs no matter what, how do we explain it happened in the 70s? So I knew enough to already know this going in. We had the Vietnam War. Vietnam is in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia was the home of the heroin trade. It's called the Golden Triangle. Trauma, violence, people using opioids to cope. So part of the reason we had the methadone push was Nixon was afraid that the white opioid addicts would have nowhere to go because they came back hooked on heroin too. White and black soldiers came back to America after Vietnam, many of them hooked on heroin. When they did longitudinal studies following up with them, they realized that white folks came back to the suburbs, they came back to GI loans, they came back to housing, they came back to ethnic communal networks and things like unions. And a substantial portion of them, when they checked back up on them, were not using heroin with no intervention whatsoever. It should not be possible if what we say about the brain disease model is true. Conversely, black folks, 7, COINTELPRO, deindustrialization, leaders being killed, communities being flooded with drugs, some people say on purpose. So with them, it was far more difficult to show changes in addiction patterns without interventions. But again, if it's the brain disease model alone, this shouldn't be possible, right? Respect individual choices of people seeking pleasure. This is a picture of Frantz Fanon, a well-known theorist, a political radical, who was born in the Caribbean island of Martinique. He became a psychiatrist in France, served with the resistance in Algeria. So he talks about how this theory of pleasure is complicated by race. So one thing that I realized discovering drug policy research is that while people are diverse in drug policy, there is sometimes, almost like a hedonism around some people's relationship to drugs in drug policy, which creates a laissez-faire, do whatever you want, we should celebrate, we should all have festivals. That's one way of doing it. But not only is that more dangerous for black people because of racism and beliefs, I was realizing there was this real sort of fetishism sometimes, of the desire to see black people intoxicated, the desire to see black people as this avatar of pure pleasure. And no one is more concise and clear on this dynamic than Frantz Fanon in terms of the enjoyment sometimes white people get from caricatures of black people's bodies in rapturous pleasure. It ties back to sex. It can easily be applied to drug policy and intoxication. It's not a comforting thing to think about. But again, a long time ago, I realized that, people just talk about legalizing everything in our community. And not only is that dangerous because of the police, what does that mean in terms of what people think about us? What does that mean in terms of corporations pushing these drugs on us? And if I had this concern, I was willing to bet that other people in the community had this concern as well. So you can't just do decrim in terms of legalization, which a lot of people push towards next. And the critique of legalization is to say to do it without going through this analysis is dangerous. All right, so I already talked about that. So this is the next critical step. Decrim is the first step towards problem social redistribution. It's funny because I've heard this argument before. So if anyone knows about justice reinvestment, this was essentially sold through the exact same logic. Get people out of jail, the money we save and get people out of jail, reinvest in community. When they did the study about what they actually did, no state out of the 30 states that did justice reinvestment invested any money in community-based preventative services. No. Many of them did save money, and they reinvested it back into the criminal legal system, things like free child services. If they say, hey, we're not community development experts. We don't have an evidence-based best practice for community-based preventative work, but we do know people got to show up on time to get to court. So we'll give money to the pretrial people to give people cell phones to get them back in court. That's not necessarily wrong, that's not reparations. And the fact that people keep pushing this as reparations means we're never going to get beyond that. Right? So the last thing, just briefly, this is a really good book, check it out if you can. It just came out a few months ago, and it talks about how the public health solutions oftentimes are presented in a way that frame out the more structural solutions. If we just need Suboxone, we just need methadone, we're never going to get to the more structural analysis, right? So, I'm sorry, now we don't have to do the literature review, that's okay. Right?
It's not the most exact.
All right, so I'm going to go to the relationship index, right? But that was our tendency to see what they were saying about the dynamic. In a nutshell, not much. Many people were talking about individual social capital in terms of helping people to get access to more services. There were not many people talking about this in terms of connecting to community itself. So I want to briefly go through my relationship index. So I'm a 37-year-old working class black male raised in the west side of Baltimore City. Father was a cop, my mom was a mother. I was raised Catholic, but now I'm spiritual, right? So I was thinking about all this as I was figuring out my contribution to the qualitative research. I did not do the interviews, but I did use our experience with LBS to help curate a selection of people who were interviewed for this project, right? So I wanted to think about some things based upon that experience. In some ways, I was raised pretty conservative around drugs, right? That experience brought me a particular perspective that I know I needed to balance out. People in my family, many of them weren't directly impacted. Some of them are. We don't talk about it a lot. But I wanted to make sure that a variety of perspectives was shown. So we had 13 interviews. So folks with experience with sex worker outreach, which is not my expertise. Age diversity, so valuing youth and elders. So a lot of times our elders are tokenized in this process. But part of the African Center Research Project was to really value their experience here, so they might be a little bit overrepresented, and I think that's fine. Formal and informal addiction treatment experience, we tried to make sure we had both. Because we were talking reparations, we actually didn't need formal addiction experts. But I wanted to include some of them because their experience is important as well, right? So we did have one white person with unique experience and ingratiated in the history and culture of Black civil society and the violence white little people can do to it. So we actually do have one white person in the sample, and they are particularly qualified because of their work in community and the perspective they have on how white institutions make more progressive work by white people more difficult. And I thought that even though it's the African Center Research paradigm, that perspective was important for the argument about what we do, right? So healers are centered, and spirituality, not just the Black church, is centered. So a lot of times people go directly to the Black church as like the only example of Black civil society. But I wanted to include different perspective, African-centered perspective, African-centered rite of passage, and people who have relationships with the Black church. Because again, this is when we talk about diversity, this type of stuff is not always on the table we talk about, right? So we do have many of the boxes checked in terms of gender diversity, but we wanted to make sure it just wasn't box checking. It was actually intentionally curating different perspectives, right? Yeah, so interview process designed to just what I call the Heisenberg effect. So the $5 word, Heisenberg is the theorist, not the dude from Breaking Bad, but the theorist who talks about observing a quantum experiment can change the outcome. And just looking at something can change it. And that's what happens when Black people are asked to talk about race. We have this script in our brain a lot of times that we know exactly what we think people want to hear. And if you don't, because I'm not doing the interviews, if you don't actively account for that, to say like, I know that that's the thing we typically do when a White person interviews you, don't do that when that is culture. Like say the things that you would say to me, or at least as much of it as you think you can say to her, because we don't want to have the just sort of typical effect where we just sort of give the script that we typically give. We actually have to interrogate the history more deeply, right? So I want to get into the quotes. I'm probably going to skip around a little bit because I did want to try to leave as much time as possible for Q&A. But yeah, ethnographic research on culture. So this is a quote, Baltimore City, I really believe that Michelle and Angus' analysis is correct and that one of the effective ways of racial control is to criminalize people even more. But I think that substance abuse is just one avenue. In fact, it's the main avenue to get more Black people in Baltimore City incarcerated. When you incarcerate the mothers and the fathers, where does that lead to children, right? It overburdens the foster care system and leads to more and more childhood trauma. And that trauma, you know, my father used to say pain begets pain, right? So just, if you just hold on, go back 1 second. So you just hold on that. So this is, again, the standard model of drug policy, but then it jumps straight to family. And that family component is oftentimes skipped over when you just talk about the person locked up. You don't just incarcerate a person, you incarcerate a family, and you incarcerate a community. And the other thing I like about this quote is that it goes directly to the foster care system. And as opposed to viewing policing as the only vector of social control, it explicitly implicates other systems that many people see as the solution to the police as an extension of social control. So these are the sort of quotes that I think, again, begin to reframe that standard model of drug decriminalization. That begin to problematize that, oh, it's just so money added, so money in foster care, it may not be perfect, but it's better than what we have. These type of quotes, I think, begin to do the work of proving the thesis in some ways, about having a more holistic analysis of social control, not just the drug criminalization. In order to understand the cultural ethos of African Americans, to solve the present and disproportionate problems that we experience, it's important to apply this model rather than Sumerian, Freudian, Marxist, etc. models. In order to understand African Americans, we need to use the metaphor of African root and American fruit. So that culturally, they argue that African Americans' cultural roots were in Africa, particularly West Africa, but their fruit was developed here in the Western Hemisphere. The goal is to control. That's the social policy perspective. That the social control perspective is the social treatment. And if one goes with the social control perspective, and social control is racialized, then that's racial control. What is the best way to control people? To convict them, lock them up. It's a vicious cycle of being in prison, coming out without providing a lot of opportunities, which then places the person at further risk. For what? Going back, a vicious cycle of incarceration. So again, this is basically, again, presenting more evidence for the theory that you can't talk about the war on drugs without talking about the cultural elements of it. Now, they're using a bunch of $5 words, that was a professor. Freudian, Marxist, these are alternative ways of understanding society. So if you understand it through the lens of culture, then you can see the positive components of the African root, but uniquely apply how they manifest themselves in America. This isn't about creating an abstracted, perfect African culture and trying to build all of addiction treatment around that. This is about recognizing the unique experience of African people in America and using that as a starting point for understanding the war on drugs and the harms of incarceration. So violence. It's tough for me because I live in the community and I have a child, and I don't think that everyone should go to jail and be out here selling drugs. I've seen firsthand people killing each other over drugs, and that has to stop as well. I'm not anti-decriminalization of substances. We can't decriminalize and not improve the conditions that facilitate the criminality at the same time. It places the blame on people, usually people of color, people who are poor, people who have less education, doesn't fall in the powers that be, and the people with money. So this is, I think, a perfect quote that just encapsulates the general theory of like, why this bill ain't gonna pass unless you actually deal with this? Because our experiences of drug liberalization come from things like crack flooding into our communities in the 80s. It comes from seeing drug selling tied directly to violence and drug intoxication being tied to acts of criminality. Now, this isn't the only thing that happens when people get high. And this person is still not anti-decriminalization despite seeing that. So this is a diunity as opposed to a dichotomous way of thinking about the world. They recognize the harm of drugs and the war on drugs, but they still see the need for decriminalization if it can invest in community. So this is why, again, that talk about irony and cultural ways of thinking is important. This is a prime example of a diunital perspective. But because we have a dichotomous perspective operating in terms of traditional drug policy, they'll give you decriminalization, but they won't give you the other stuff. Because that thing, like, that's not what's on the table, that's not what we're talking about. Well, for black people, that is what you're talking about, that's all we're talking about. Right? Believe me. I remember when we were in the 90s and the early 2000s, when that gun trace task force, all that stuff they got locked up for. I remember in Sandtown, the boys were talking about the police being just another gang because they jump out on our boys. And the unmarked cars that come into the community and the neighborhoods and jump out and start knocking people around and pushing people around and accusing people of things. And the children experience this. How can they go to the police with anything when the police cannot be trusted? And they use the police for busting people and taking their drugs and not reporting it. So here we're talking about children about trying to do the right thing and obey the law. And all of that, and they say, well, look at the people who are doing the law. The contradiction there, it's amazing. So I think it's really interesting that many of the people talking about drug decriminalization, this could have been another appendage of the standard model. They basically say that, look, the reason why we're experiencing police brutality is the war on drugs. This is a quote that's like, no. We're experiencing police brutality because the police have a social control mission around black people. And it's very convenient for drug policy advocates to say, if we just decriminalize drugs, that will eliminate the social control excuse police have. This is the quote that talks about how they don't need an excuse. Social control is fundamentally part of their mission. I think I'm gonna clip this part out. They also talked about how police are selling drugs. The gun trace task force is of course selling drugs. How are you gonna decriminalize drugs when the cops themselves see the value of selling them in the illegal market? So the idea that we can just legalize drugs and ignore the social control role that drugs play and the economic role drugs play, not just for the community, but even for people in the police department. It shows a level of ignorance about the reality of on the ground in the black community, which I think is why we try to do these interviews with people who knew some of these blind spots, right? Rehab. Let's say my uncle was to get locked up for possession, because he had some dope on. Let's say he gets a court date and he went before the judge. And the judge was like, all right, you either gotta go through 90 days and go to the drug treatment program. It's gonna be like a list of pre-approved vendors that you gotta go through. You don't know who works for who and what's going to work. And a lot of times that just means creating economic stability for the people who are auxiliarily connected to that industry or to the criminal justice system. Those are the people that get the contracts and have the connections. In a traditional economy that benefits from like the sustaining of this economy and this ecosystem, because usually, again, I think systems white supremacy and anti-blackness don't allow the thought that black people can be the architects of their own solutions. So obviously I was happy to get this quote. So I'm like, okay, it's not just me saying this stuff. I've been telling y'all this for years. People say this, not just me. But the idea that rehab and social services in of themselves are progressive, anti-racist, beneficent interventions. They are an industry, and they are an industry built off of suffering. Does not mean they are not important, but that means in our current environment, simply investing in what is ignores the way this industry was constructed in a way that it's not. Many of the people being served by this industry don't see people like them benefiting and don't believe the services are given in a way that's adequate. But people are so desperate for something, anything to invest in. They just invest in anything they can give money to and so money is the problem. So I think this kind of gets that distinction between the rhetorical ethic and the existential ethic, where people are looking for a more comprehensive investment in justice. What they're getting is, I'm going to say harm reduction But it's really just funding people going to stuff like this and making it mandatory. So rhetorically, that is compassionate. But existentially, that's just extending the prison dynamic to the rehab. And so what you have here is the distinction between the rhetorical ethic and the existential ethic. NPIC is nonprofit industrial complex. What I will say about the original practice at Penn North was that the addiction was never the center. The people are the center. I think that's a core thing that changes sort of the way people, also because then people will say this like, I feel like you treat me as, you see me as a whole human being. It's not like a number, I'm not just one more case. This quote continues. But over time, like the intricacies of payment structures, and then you need housing, right? So eventually it becomes clear that you need supportive housing. You couldn't do the core detox, couldn't be done on site. Again, right, that's where like the people can get shipped out to the Eastern Shore, to the residential, because you can't do it. The medical system is set up when you either have a physician on site all the time who can oversee people, and also you have to have a residential facility in order to, and again, you just think that, you know, if they go back like Lincoln Detox, it's like you sort of sidestep the whole medical system as best you can. And you just do what you can, and you get funded to do that outside of the system. Once you're embedded with the system, you're beholden to all those regulations. And it's so that just one of those things where almost all of it is either a community-based facility or it's a medical-based facility. So this is a very clear critique of that last part of the standard model, which is that the medical intervention is going to be better for the community because it is benevolent. So if you see her example, she called attention to something called Lincoln Detox. So briefly, Lincoln Detox was a facility in New York, the Bronx, that was taken over by the Black Panthers and the Puerto Rican Young Boys. So Lincoln Detox was taken over because there was no addiction treatment for the folks coming home from Vietnam. And what they were arguing is that, like, look, not only do you got to do something for these addicts, we don't trust methadone because we're political radicals. Methadone means that Uncle Sam, the person who just sent me to Vietnam, controls the supply of the product I need to live. They basically become my pusher. Not only do I want freedom from heroin, I want freedom from you, the US government, and methadone. And I'm going to do that through acupuncture, which helps people deal with detox cravings and pains through a Chinese, natural process, and through political socialization. So it wasn't just acupuncture is better than methadone. That wasn't the argument. They weren't kicking people out who was on methadone. They weren't kicking people out who were using drugs. But the idea is that through ingratiating you into the community, through political activism, Lincoln Detox can serve as a radical attempt to make it so you deal with the thing that you wanted to get away from with your addiction in the first place, the sense of worthlessness and powerlessness. So in Lincoln Detox, of course, when Rockefeller took over New York, they were like, we got to get these folks, they can't run this facility anymore. But it was the public health establishment that essentially turned a blind eye, because they didn't like the fact that Lincoln Detox was against methadone. So they're like, well, it's not professional, it's not sanitary, it's not evidence-based best practice. So as opposed to supporting them, helping them develop the code, defending them, many people in the public health system turned a blind eye or co-opted their ideas and then resold them, right? So this Lincoln Detox example, and excuse me for the technical difficulties, is a powerful example of what happens when the medical system begins to co-opt indigenous community practice. Because what happened with Lincoln Detox, they still have a Lincoln Detox. They even still have acupuncture. But what they say is, if you need the acupuncture, you gotta lose the politics. So that's what happened with Lincoln Detox, is that the political analysis that drove Lincoln Detox was taken out, but they kept the acupuncture, made it go along with the methadone. And so the actual political theory that drove the takeover in the first place was taken out as the medical system was serving. So this interviewee is inserting that as in what they were trying to do at Penn North was inspired by Lincoln Detox. That's what they wanted. What they could get funded to do was the co-opted version of Lincoln Detox. Methadone, maybe a little bit of group, some community care, but they couldn't get money for residential, and they darn sure couldn't invest in a larger political, social, re-socialization of people. That's beyond the caption for what you need funding to do. So these ideas of streams, of funding, determining the nature of service, that's the nonprofit industrial complex. It's not a critique of not enough Black people in foundations. It's not a critique of not enough Black people getting funded by government grants. It's a recognition of the social system of control that they're able to shape the vista of freedom that you can even believe is possible by what is fundable by these people. Another one. There used to be a monthly meeting of residential providers to talk about the changes in the field of residential housing and network with each other. Horrible abuses were happening there. I've seen it firsthand. Horrible abuses in outpatient and inpatient programs. Client trade, forgery of paperwork, and vending clients who didn't actually exist. Creating whole places from the ground up who didn't exist so we can build them. Fraudulent audits, where you get teams of people to come and create fake notes and fake clients to justify billing. The assumption is that's just how it is. The programs are now big, built their foundations on institutions on fraudulence, navigating fraudulence, and learning how to navigate fraudulence, and teaching other people how to navigate fraudulence. They are good-hearted programs. They're willing to build slow, so they didn't take on the burdens that call for them to have to do those deficit things. I've seen the work in recovery homes, drug courts, and outpatient, inpatient, medication management, everywhere. Yeah, I've seen these things. Most of treatment from my experience has been driven by, of course, whatever outcome goals the program has. The outcome goal, usually the primary outcome goal that they may say on paper, but it usually isn't this, of course, the healing of the client or the patient, that we want to see them go through this to this. The using to sober to in recovery or maintenance. That's the underlying goal, but the truth of the matter that's driven by money. Much of the time it's going to take someone to move through our treatment protocols so that we can prove to the state that we are meeting our goals, so we can prove that we deserve more money. Or the university. How much money do we have to do things to take clients into the community? Or do things socially with clients? How much of the creation of alternative programs is going to take away from this primary programming that we feel is more efficacious than whatever the alternative programming is? And more in alignment with potentially the funding sources. The drive is, of course, about how do we keep our jobs? How do we keep money coming in? So this is as, I think, direct as it can be. And again, these may have been folks who started with good intentions. And many of these folks may even be Black folks. So it's not to say that only Black people do this. And unfortunately, because of white supremacy, many Black people are forced to essentially hustle all other people's suffering to survive. But the reality is that, again, if we just think of investment as investing in these big groups because they have the capacity, then you're rewarding the callous ignoring of the suffering of our community in terms of providing services that are actually reflecting of what's needed. But again, if you have a Eurocentric vision of time, that immediate progress is most important, you invest in these people. Because your vision of solution is so tied to immediate progress. Because any immediate progress will never lead to more progress. But if you have a circular notion of time, you can see this as another example of the long history of people stepping in for our community, hustling off our suffering, and making us dependent on them to survive. So if you can go beyond the immediate suffering and see this in a larger historical framework, you don't have to fund these people just because overdose is going on all over the place. You can spend the time to invest in alternative research methodologies, alternative treatment methodologies. You don't have to tie yourself to this institution built off of fraudulence. But that's not the dominant perspective in the funding circles. They see overdose go up, money goes out, we want overdose to go down. If you can prove that, we can keep funding it. So this also can be a critique of quantification and the quantifiable number go up, line will go down mentality as the center of funding. All right. So for the sake of time, I'm going to make this the last quote. There's obviously way more in the report. Please look at them. A lot of this since on Sandtown, Freddie Gray was obviously very traumatic for people. And for some reason, this one really hits me. I'm going to try to explain why. Called Betrayal. And then actually, right out of Freddie Gray, what happened was all these cameras came. And the people were like, well, what does the neighborhood need? Alicia Keys came. And they were like, we need a safe place for our kids to go. Like, literally took over the laundromat, the vacant laundromat next door. We renovated it like over the course of a week and a half. And the next day, Kids had a safe place to go, basically, and that was it. Of course, now where is it? It doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't exist anymore. So the interview repeats that statement. One of the things that came up was like, well, how are you going to have these kids in this, this facility right next to the drug treatment center? What you don't understand is I saw those, like some of those kids in the drug treatment center were also like 19, 20, 22 years old. And they would go and they would play with the little kids, so it'd be healing for everybody. Because those kids are teenagers now, what do you think their experience is? These people come in one more time, say they care about us, and say they're going to help us, and they disappear again. Do you know what that does to people? If you talk about the history of that part of Baltimore, that's it. It's essentially it. People will say they give a shit, will come in, and then disappear. So again, this is a powerful quote, being someone who will help, obviously, do the protesting around Freddie Gray, and impacting me deeply, because I think that's the way a lot of people feel. This wouldn't typically be seen as a drug policy relevant comment. But it's so important because I just think it's happening right now with drug policy. This is what they're going to do if we don't do something different. They're going to come in, they're going to build a bunch of programming because they have a progressive, linear view of time. It's not necessarily saying that they're people. Their vision is more is better. And if you start doing some stuff, we'll inevitably do more better stuff. What happens in reality is they start doing some stuff, realize they either can't get it funded, or the money runs out, and it disappears. And they're like, well, we tried. It's good we did something, and they move on. But this is where the alternative worldview comes in, because you said you were going to help. So this is an existential ethic, colliding with a rhetorical ethic, right? So you have people who saw the commitment as not just, I'm going to help when the grant cycle is expedient. I'm going to help when the uprising is a hot topic and a moneymaker. If you're going to help, you're going to help. It's an existential commitment that gets violated when people do programming based upon funding cycles and grant cycles. So again, a well-meaning person with decrim is going to invest in drug treatment in this very community using the exact same assumptions this person is critiquing. And because they have a different view of what success looks like, a different cultural relationship to what programming should be, I really am afraid we're going to have the same dynamic for yourself with decrim. Yeah, go ahead. So for the sake of time, I'm going to start here. All right, so there should be plenty of time for Q&A. I have lots of recommendations. This is, many of this is in the report, many of this is in the document. But this is the heuristic research portion. This is the end of the academic research paragraph. So with drug policy and defending decrim, it's trying to decenter the link between drug criminalization and street violence. That's a mistake. Violence is a complex issue, but a critical mass of the Black community will not accept decrim without a clear plan to address endemic street violence. There is no trade-off between overdose deaths and violence deaths as a frame. A comprehensive decrim plan would address both. So this is an attempt to intervene in that political expediency, which is twice as many people are dying from overdose as died from murder in Baltimore City. This is not to say that overdose is not an absolutely critical issue right now. But if you're talking about political institutional stability, buy-in from the Black community, the experience of crack and the experience of everyday gun violence, which is not all tied to drug dealing, but some of it is, makes it so that these two issues are linked so deeply in people's mind that you have to address those. This is not what drug decrim advocates typically say. I know it may be shocking to some people in this room, but many people say, oh no, drug dealers don't always shoot people. There's no statistical significant proof between drug dealing increasing and violence increasing. And that may be statistically true in many ways, but anecdotally and experientially, the Black community has seen the ties so deeply. And even if there's no link, you can't just come in my community, legalize drugs, and leave us in the midst of all this violence and confusion. Because we know that, the white kids who need safe consumption sites and Narcan and Suboxone, they'll get it. But then you just leave us in the community that you disrupted if you were on drugs. That's not acceptable. So even if there isn't a direct link between drug dealing and shootings, which I think many people would contest, you still have to address both if you want people to buy in to the decrim. Beyond public health, individualistic worldview. Centered on overdose prevention, this obscures more communalist vision of community survival. So I think we've talked a lot about that. The colonial public health infrastructure means mere integration does not inherently liberate, but risks becoming another vector of social control. So this is just an example of public health's origins are so tied to viewing brown people as disease. So think about cholera and malaria and AIDS. So this is the genesis of the public health system, and now we talk about addiction being an epidemic and tying it to Black people. We talk about violence being an epidemic and tying it to Black people. So there's a real risk that as opposed to viewing the people as needing to be cured, you see them as the disease in themselves. And that impacts the way you design treatment protocols. So look at 12 step. 12 step says if your friends are using, cut them off. They're no good for you. What does that mean from a racialized perspective? If you go to an NA meeting and you get a sponsor who says you gotta cut out your whole family. What does that mean from a Black communal perspective? Anti-Blackness is a logical extension of that thought in many ways. And we don't have a system that accounts for that because the NA people have the infrastructure. So when you say invest in treatment, a lot of that is not high on the 12 step, which can be good, has good elements, it's communal, it's spiritual, but it's literally designed by white evangelical white men from Ohio in the 1930s. That's the birth of AA. And now it's crossed over to MA. And people are working to take the parts that work for Black people and gain capacity to do more of that, but invest in that stuff. Don't just invest in NA as a whole and assume that's a safe place for us. It's not. Because we will be viewed as these entities, because that's what tends to happen in America. Right. Respect communities' legitimate concerns around harm reduction. Don't just assume it's respectability politics. This is really important. So a lot of folks from the drug policy space come out of academic sex work circles, and the critique of respectability politics is important. I believe it's also been applied to Black churches and Black elected officials in a way that obscures the reality of what they have to deal with. So in the 90s, the face of resistance to needle exchange was Black elected officials. And they were often cast as scientifically ignorant, callous to people suffering, because they didn't immediately support needle exchange when the AIDS epidemic presented itself. Now, when folks got more knowledge and the Democratic Party shifted its tone, a lot of these Black elected officials flipped very, very quickly, in a mere matter of years, to supporting needle exchange. But many people in drug policy still bemoan Black conservative lawmakers, Black conservative church-going people who don't like harm reduction in people. I think it's a conversation that has to be more respectful and recognize the reality of what these folks have seen. It might be different than what many people in the drug policy have. Also, it doesn't account for the diversity amongst Black elders, where many Black churches were more open to supporting sex work and more open to supporting needle exchange than oftentimes gets narrated, and are more open to defriend and progressive policy now. Right, this has to be a conversation that happens with the existing drug policy advocates and the Black people in the community who have the ear of a lot of elected officials, community associations and churches. All right, so I think because of that, we can kind of, we can skip this example, just scroll through. Yeah, click again, wait, stop right here. So this is Ron Daniels, not the Ron Daniels from Institute for the Black World 21st Century, but Ron Daniels from DC. He's a Black harm reduction needle exchange elder. So he would do things like go around the streets with money. He would say things like, hey, you know, here's $10. If you want to spend it on drugs, just don't tell me, right? I want to say I love you, I care about you, and we don't want you to die out here on the streets from these needles. We got clean needles if you need them. So this is not an evidence-based best practice that I'm telling you. But it created a sense of care and recognition of humanity of people using on the streets, and make it so people still talk about Ron Daniels to this day. Now, can you imagine the paperwork nightmare of trying to do a grant with that methodology? This is what we're talking about. It's not to say that grants are bad, it's not to say that funding is bad. It's to say that grassroots perspective on harm reduction and drug policy from the Black experience, because they recognize that many people do feel outside of the human community because their addiction is robbing them of agency. But to express care, even if it's through money, was an important methodological thing he chose to do. That just does not fit how we do grants and paperwork at all. So this is to recognize that these are the things you bump up against when you professionalize and you non-profitize, which in many ways, again, Lincoln detox, that was radical work. So as we move into the professionalization of deep criminal harm reduction, we risk losing some of these organic Black grassroots methodologies. Yep, so methadone has gone from more holistic roots to a gas and go model, which decreases overdose but lacking capacity for comprehensive social transformation. Methadone was not designed by its founders to be this way. It was designed to be part of a more holistic, progressive intervention in people's lives. But Nixon saw it, and they said, well, people steal to feed their habits. If we can feed their habits, they won't steal. There was criminalization that was the core of how methadone got presented in America. It's very different than Suboxone, which again was marketed the exact opposite way. But if you don't recognize how methadone was brought in, because what people hear drug policy people say, and this report is largely geared to creating a conversation in the drug policy community. Black people hear people say methadone is the gold standard. And that's not how a lot of Black people see methadone. It's the gold standard of anything. Because they see that it doesn't have, they see lines of people lined up, they don't see people being cared for, they see it looking more like a prison than a healthcare facility. So yes, it keeps people alive, and that's important. It does a good job of that. But it's not the only thing that could do that. It's the only thing that can do that within the current political environment we have now. How do we create a new political environment? That should be more of a central question. All right. Advancement to Suboxone solves some problems, but failed to offer a vision of community reintegration. We talked about that. Mandatory rehab is just prison by another name. I don't think that needs much explanation. Lack of spiritual component to harm reduction. Well, to continue reliance on 12 step for spiritual African-American patients with substance use disorder, SUD. So this is like a battle in the harm reduction space between many folks who are secular and critical of 12 step because they don't feel it's evidence-based, they don't think it's scientific enough. But the reality is, be it from our African-American experience or our African heritage, many Black people are spiritual. So as opposed to demonizing AA for its spirituality, question it for its roots in White evangelical spirituality and not liberation theology. Question it for not effectively integrating the lessons of political engagement through things like Lincoln detox. I mean, think of the serenity prayer. I mean, Lord, help me to have the strength to accept what I can change, change what I can change, accept what I can with wisdom and obedience. That's an incredibly political statement. That can be an incredibly demobilizing statement, depending on how you interpret what you can't change, i.e. society, politics. What you can change is whether you take that drink or not. It's an incredibly individualistic worldview that may not fit an incredibly communal people. So that does not mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater. It means that you interrogate the people doing work to take some of the best elements of AA and NA and 12-step and give capacity to build out an actual ecosystem that reflects those best elements. Part of 12-step being so popular is that it's free. Just walk into almost any church basement in America on certain nights of the week, and you actually have a group of people helping you out. But the actual ability to use insurance, the difficulty of using insurance to navigate the addiction system is intense. And you're going to have an addiction co-op and not have a traditional ownership model, how to take insurance. If you're not doing a standard residential rehab facility, it's hard to take insurance. So people in the insurance community could do well to research and talk about how we begin to possibly fund some of these like sober coaching models, which only rich people have access to right now, because they aren't available for insurance reimbursement. So that's just a wide worldview of research that has to be done around what needs to be built to replace the infrastructure we have now. But we have to actually do the work of making the case of not just investing in the infrastructure we have now, because the need is so great. Yeah. That's just a fine business stuff. Right, you're right there. Thank you. So just appreciate you all sticking with me. Again, this is a lot of content. Please read the report. And with that, I thank you. And we have about 40 minutes. Awesome. That's all we have to do.
So I have a question. I heard some trepidation in your presentation about the legalization of all drugs. So my question is, how do you solve people's fears about the legalization of all drugs because decrim does nothing to protect the drug supply. And
Absolutely.
you're not gonna see a reduction in the violence associated with, drug trafficking with legalization, so.
Well, we need to really define what legalization is. And because when people hear legalization, they hear market. They hear capitalist entities using these substances to make profit. That doesn't have to be what legalization is. There are other models such as safe supply, which is more regulated and not tied to profit making. But people have incredible anxieties around people who are traumatized, people who have been targeted through things like the crack epidemic, with their communities being flooded with drugs. And not just the crack epidemic, people have lots of anxieties about cannabis legalization. In terms of, people profiting off of the need for cannabis in the community. So again, if it's tied to a holistic vision of investing in community, I think that legalization argument will hit differently. But what people fear is that, again, rhetorical ethics. People might say legalization and investment, but all we ever get is what they can make profit of. So you would need to build a type of deep relationship with community where if you say, I will not support legalization without investment, they believe you. Because the problem is people have been saying that to them, and when rubber hits the road and they have to support a bill in the state capital or DC and get legalization without investment or nothing, 9 times out of 10, they do legalization, but they will come back and get the investment later. We'll come back and get the social justice later, and that later never comes. And again, White Out was a very good book that talks about that argument from the perspective of white policy folks. But again, our perspective of LBS, I think, it's taken us like a decade of work to build the credibility where we can even begin to broach that conversation. And that's not a positive thing to hear when you're on a 3-year grant cycle to support decrim advocacy in Maryland. That's why we don't want our policy work that funded. Because we've been talking about reparations for the war on drugs for 10 years now. It's going to take a few more years to roll out. That work wasn't grant funded. So we have the ability to work on that for 13 years because we found other ways to make money, and we've been talking about it since like 2015, right? And so when people see you that consistent on an issue, you begin to get a degree of credibility where you can say, look, I know what you think when you hear legalization. You think about the 80s and crack and drug zombies on the streets. I'm telling you that we are committed to recognizing that, first of all, as long as drugs are illegal, the cops are going to use them to hurt black people. So one of the strongest arguments for legalization is like literally until it's legal, they're going to use drugs to hurt us. Even right now, weed is legal, but we're still having a fight to make it so that the smell of cannabis is not an excuse to search your car. So as long as it's like legal, they're going to have more tools, but even when it is legal, you're going to have to prove to folks that you're going to have to commit to enforce that progressive vision even after legalization. Because what people see is you get the bill passed, you raise your hand in victory on the courthouse steps, and you move on to the next grant cycle. So if you can prove to people that you have a degree of commitment to the enforcement of a larger social justice vision, they may rock with you in ways that the current drug policy advocacy ecosystem is not designed to produce that level of buy-in. In fact, it's the opposite. Where they have to take a short-term goal. Because they have to show their funders a success story to get funded by someone else in the next grant cycle. So we have a system that's not designed for the deep relationship building and the political methodology. Again, this is a methodology. Like saying no, pass nothing, rather than pass that bill, that's crappy. That's just not purity politics. That's not us being more radical than that. That's a political methodology to preserve the type of credibility we need to keep buy-in in our community to pass more progressive legislation down the line. I think that's kind of been dismissed as purity politics by people who won't admit it, but really know to get their grants funded, they have to deliver something. Right.
Yeah, so trying my best to frame this question, but when I think about what we just heard and a lot about, rehab and dealing with criminalization and how that has impacted communities. But I always see this link between illegals, drugs, and legal drugs and looking at the legal side and how that aspect of it, thinking about, you know, the capitalist approach to medicine, you know, pharmaceuticals, all that stuff, how that has impacted communities, and is there a link there? Is there another level of of the fight that happens there?
The link is very clear in the white communities because of the tie between addiction, prescription opioids, you know, Percocets, things of that nature, and the rise of addiction in the white community. When they started to cut back on prescribing the prescription opioids, they switched over to heroin. The white community did, and that's where it became a public health issue, opioid addiction, right? I think in our community, we're thinking about things like the overprescription of ADHD medicine to young people, the overprescription of anxiety medicine that primes a lot of young people at a young age. And it's important to understand that that's not a clean line between the states of intoxication that are medically prescribed and people seeking recreational states of intoxication later in life. That's not necessarily problematic. It's problematic potentially when you tie it with disinvestment, trauma, the prison industrial complex, the foster care industrial complex, all of which is uniquely targeted to Black people. And when you have that addiction-agenic community condition that's produced, it's not innate but produced, some of those pharmacological elements, you know, can switch over into potential priming for addiction, right? So again, that's not to say that people should stop taking their medicine. I want to be very clear about that. But that not to say ADHD isn't real per se, but it is to say that it's very clear in the white community, the link between the for-profit pharmaceutical community and addiction. Here, it's just seen as like those people are innately drug seeking, or those people are so traumatized that it makes sense they get addicted. But trauma is not a natural one-way stop to addiction. It's more likely when your environment's been denuded of community support through the war on drugs, through hyper-incarceration. So as opposed to, again, well-informed people who'll be like trauma-informed care means closing the prescribing gap between white people and Black people when it comes to like prescription opioids. That may not even necessarily be entirely wrong per se, because we do know Black people are perceived as needing less pain medication. But to say that that itself is the limit of social justice means that you're locked too much into a biomedical worldview. So again, a lot of our folks in the public health community are so worried about what this critique means for their community. Does this mean Black people won't stop taking medication? I would say no. That was to say that we want to see you to be more present and understanding. When we say reparations, we don't just mean give us a thing like opioids as white people. And if you think that and you have not studied reparations, you've not listened to Black people, or you don't have the space in your brain to envision us having the capacity to build out institutions for ourselves that don't need you. So much of the public health community's equity, social justice approach is essentially closing the gaps between Black folks and white folks, including in prescribing and diagnosis. But again, without a larger vision of social justice and Black autonomy, that itself could potentially backfire.
What's actually expected to happen in Annapolis before this session ends when it comes to the community reinvestment and all that?
Thank you for asking. So it's already passed. That was in the bill last year.
Right.
We were very intentional about that because we knew this year would be all on the business side. Now what they're hammering out is the details about how the money's going to get kicked out and what the tax rate is, like how much money's going to be in the pot. So we feel pretty okay about what's happening in Annapolis for the most part. The question is now, what's going to happen at the city council?
Right.
Because the way we designed the bill was not to keep the money in Annapolis. It was designed to build local control so that every county council or city council has to pass for itself what they want to do with their chunk of money. We had a hearing last week where the law department gave what I think is a pretty specious challenging to our framing of the bill. Basically saying that the state bill did not authorize a commission, which is what we presented, the Reparations Commission, being the entity which made decisions on how the funding was made. And basically questioning what that legislative intent of the state bill.
Right.
And we were like, dude, we wrote the state bill. You know, so I don't know about all the reasons why they are interpreting the state bill that way, but we need to be assured that the actual intent is fulfilled as opposed to the money being controlled by some physical intermediary in city governance, or some, executive, i.e. mayor-controlled entity. The goal was to make sure that there was legitimate community control over the decision-making process on that money, which is why our commission, the idea we had was to have, like with the Police Accountability Board, the city council people from every district appoint one person to the reparations commission. So you had geographic diversity, and you had the actual city council people, who may not be perfect, but you have a genuinely higher ability to influence them than you do a mayor, a delegate, a senator, or the governor. So that, again, that's a political methodology. That's not saying that the mayor is bad, the council is good. That's saying community control is good. What is the policy mechanism most amenable to community control? And we came up with a commission appointed by the city council people, and we're gonna have another hearing on April 25th at City Hall to try to clear the hurdles of the law department and any questions that the city council might have, to get this out of committee and to get it before the council for a vote. So the real push right now is at City Hall, addressing the concerns of the law department. Which again, we think, for example, there are a lot of things we can do, but that's what that is right now, City Hall.
So the hearing at City Hall, I wasn't able to go. Was that one that's recorded by Charter
Yes.
TV?
Yes, we have the clips posted on our Facebook page, and I believe YouTube as well, right?
It's on YouTube, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So being able to, if you just go watch that, I think it was like an hour long. But yeah, I wanted to give folks the highlights, because that's the battle now, is to make sure that the reparations, because we have reparations commissions all over the country. I believe none of them have a dedicated pot of money and clear executive authority to control where money goes. So we have a lot of commissions that are basically making reports, hoping to influence allocations by the state or the mayor or the governor. And we want to make sure the commission itself has the authority to make those funding decisions. We think the innovation in even the theory of reparations, and how reparations is being conceptualized and advanced in America.
Is there, what time does that meet on the 25th?
I have it in my calendar, so it's April 25th, the voting session starts at 2 o'clock, right?
Yep. Around 2 o'clock at City Hall.
Yeah, 2 o'clock, City Hall, April 25th, Cheryl Green, Middleton Committee. So we're obviously be posting about it, and again, that's just an example of the type of larger policy intervention that we think has to be tied to a deep harm reduction agenda to get the kind of buy-in, That's not to say that overworked harm reduction advocates should be all over our bill, because, it's our bill, right? It's not always like we need to lead on it. But having folks see support and also just being invested in understanding the theory, and understanding the people who we believe need to be empowered. Kind of people perceiving enthusiasm for the people community wants to see empowered, harm reduction people tying their professional credibility to empowering those same people. I think that would be a big step forward in dealing with the fear the community has around harm reduction and decrim and drug policy being a professional come up or bad that some people get off of this really horrible overdose epidemic in our community.
Thank you, Lawrence. Give a round of applause. We're going to wrap up this evening. A couple notes before y'all leave. Again, if you want to purchase a copy of the report, we have them up front. Suggested donation is $10 because that helps us pay for the printing of it. And if you find that you're at a place or organization, department, where you're like, hey, we want copies too, just let us know, and we can help you get copies of the report. But you can also direct you to the website. The report is on our website, lbsbaltimore.com. You click on publications, it's up there for free, so you can read it for free. And last thing I want to mention is that, again, this event, well, number one, shout out to the Lewis Museum for having us. I really appreciate it. And all these events that we have during the year are public, free, open to the public for a reason. Because, a lot of folks, when they hear about drug decriminalization and stuff like that, there are oftentimes not enough free public forums for you to ask these kinds of questions about these kinds of complex issues. And so we try to make ourselves available for these free public educational events because we find them to be helpful for folks who are doing work and take their lines of work. And so if you like what Lawrence had to say this evening and you're like, hey, I want to bring Lawrence to come speak to my class, my staff, et cetera, we also do speaking engagements. So again, you can reach out to us through our website. Email is info@lbsbaltimore.com. And, this event was brought to you by people who fund and support the organization. So if you want to become a sustainer, if you like what you heard tonight, and you want to support us in the future, please become a sustainer. So thank you again, and hope you get home safe.